The finality of the orphanage gate closing behind her was a sound that echoed not in the crisp autumn air, but in the hollow space of her bones. It was October 11th, 1876. Alara was 16 years old. For 16 years, the Providence Municipal Orphanage had been the only home she had ever known. A world of gray wool blankets, watery oatmeal, and the drone of recited psalms. Now, that world had expelled her, not with malice, but with the indifferent certainty of a turning page in a ledger. Her time was up. Matron Gable, a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched from the cold and a lifetime of other people's sorrows, had pressed a small, oilskin-wrapped parcel into Alara's hands. "This was left for you," she had stated, her voice as dry as winter leaves. "By your mother," they said. "It is all there is." Inside was a folded, yellowed deed to a plot of land designated only as North Slope, Lot 72. A small, tarnished silver locket containing nothing but dust, and a single, heavy iron key, its shaft intricate and its teeth deeply cut. A small, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with a spidery, unfamiliar script and strange diagrams, completed the meager inheritance. She had no money save for the $2 the matron had given her as a parting gesture, a sum meant to last until she found a position as a scullery maid or a laundress. But the logging season had been poor, and the mining prospects in the high peaks had dwindled. The town of Providence, nestled in a high mountain valley, was retracting into itself for the winter, hoarding its resources. There were no positions for a girl with no family and no connections. For 2 weeks, she slept in a corner of the livery stable, trading mucking out stalls for a roof over her head and a handful of oats she would boil into a paste. The nights grew colder. The wind carried the first scent of snow from the jagged peaks that walled in the valley. Desperation was a cold, constant companion. Her only asset was the worthless plot of land. North Slope was considered unusable, a steep, rocky grade of land good for little more than grazing goats, and no one in Providence kept goats. But the deed, and more importantly, the journal, consumed her thoughts. The script was difficult, but the drawings were clear. They showed a structure sunk into the earth, a long, angled roof of glass facing the southern sun, and detailed cross-sections of stone walls and ventilation shafts. The journal spoke of the earth's constant warmth and the sun's winter gift. It was a language of forgotten wisdom, a methodology of survival that resonated with a deep, instinctual part of her being. It was a plan. It was her only hope. With the first flurries of snow dusting the ground, Alara knew she could not wait. The livery owner had told her his charity had its limits. She needed supplies. She needed tools. She needed the town's permission, or at least its tolerance, to salvage what she could from the boneyard of discarded materials behind the blacksmith shop. For that, she had to face the town council. The Providence Town Council met every Tuesday in the meeting hall, a drafty timber building that smelled of wet wool and old piety. It was a council of 4 men, stern-faced patriarchs who governed the town's temporal and spiritual affairs with equal gravity. Deacon Miller, the chairman, was a man whose thin lips seemed perpetually pursed in judgment. Mr. Blackwood owned the timber mill, Mr. Thorne the general store, and Mr. Hemlock was the town's blacksmith and undertaker, a practical combination in such a harsh climate. They sat at a heavy oak table, the weak afternoon light from the tall windows glinting off their silver hair and watch chains. Alara stood before them, a small, solitary figure in her threadbare orphanage dress. She held the journal in her hands, its leather cover worn smooth. She did not ask for charity, not in the way they understood it. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I have come to petition for access to the town's scrap pile. I require discarded timber, old nails, perhaps cracked panes of glass. I intend to build a shelter on my inherited land before the deep snows arrive." Deacon Miller peered down at her over his spectacles. His gaze was one of profound and weary condescension. "A shelter, child. A young woman alone has no business building a shelter. Your place is in a Christian home, under the guidance of a family. Have you sought a position with any of the good wives of this town?" "I have, Deacon," Alara replied, her chin held high. "There is no work to be had. My plan is to build a winter house, a dwelling sunken into the earth as described in this book. It will be warm and self-sufficient." She held up the journal. Mr. Thorne, a portly man whose wealth was built on selling shovels and flour at inflated prices, gave a short, barking laugh. "Sunken into the earth? You mean a dugout? A gopher hole? Child, that is no way for a person to live. That is a tomb, not a home. You will catch a chill and be in your grave before the new year." "It is based on sound principles," Alara insisted, her voice gaining a note of frustrated urgency. She opened the journal to a diagram showing the sun's low winter angle. "It captures the sun's heat in the soil and stone, a principle of thermal mass. The earth itself provides insulation. It is designed to stay above freezing, even on the coldest nights, with minimal fuel." Mr. Blackwood, a man who had made his fortune felling the ancient trees of the valley, scoffed. "Thermal mass? Principles? These are foolish pagan notions. A proper home is made of wood, child. Good, solid timber, with a proper hearth and a steep roof to shed the snow. We have lived in these mountains for generations. We know how to survive a winter. You propose to live in a pit? Like an animal?" He gestured around the meeting hall. "This is a proper building. This is civilization." "I do not have the money for a timber house, Mr. Blackwood," Alara stated plainly. "I have nothing but what is in this parcel. I am not asking for a handout. I am asking for what the town has already thrown away. I will provide my own labor." Deacon Miller held up a hand, silencing the others. His voice took on a tone of paternalistic pity that was more insulting than their open scorn. "Alara, we are not without compassion. The good Lord instructs us to care for the orphan and the widow. But he also instructs us to be wise. Your proposal is folly. It is born of desperation and, I fear, a youthful ignorance. We cannot, in good conscience, sanction such a dangerous and unseemly endeavor. You will catch your death of consumption in such a damp and dreary hole." He leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Your options are clear. You will redouble your efforts to find a place as a domestic servant. If that fails, the town provides a poorhouse. It is not comfortable, but it is warm and safe. It is a proper Christian charity. We will not have you dying of your own foolishness on a hillside and becoming a burden on the town's conscience and Mr. Hemlock's services." The decision was final. Their faces were closed, their minds made up. They saw a foolish girl, not a determined survivor. They saw a problem to be managed, not a person to be heard. They spoke of wisdom, but their wisdom was a rigid, unthinking adherence to the way things had always been done. They could not conceive of a solution that did not involve a wood frame house and a mountain of firewood, a solution that lay outside their narrow experience. She was dismissed. Not one of them had offered her a meal. Not one of them had truly listened, and not one of them would have to face the coming winter with nothing but $2 and a desperate, unconventional plan. Alara walked out of the meeting hall, the men's dismissive words echoing in her ears. Their rejection did not break her spirit. It forged it into something harder, something as resilient as the iron key she clutched in her pocket. They would not help her, so she would help herself. Their comfortable, conventional world had cast her out. She would build her own. The parcel of land, Lot 72, was a full 2-mile walk from the edge of town, up a steep and winding track that was already slick with frozen mud. The north-facing slope was, as advertised, a useless tumble of rock and stunted pine. But the deed's map directed her around to the south-facing side of the same hill, a slope the town had never bothered to survey properly. It was here, shielded from the prevailing northern winds and blessed with the full arc of the winter sun, that she found it. Hidden behind a thicket of thorny bushes and a curtain of ancient ivy was a section of rock face that was unnaturally flat, and set into it was the dark, rust-streaked outline of an iron door. The keyhole was choked with grime, but the old key, after a moment of stubborn resistance, turned with a deep, grating groan. The door opened into darkness and the smell of cold, damp earth. It was not a cave, not a natural formation. The walls were roughly hewn but deliberately shaped. It was a fissure, a deep crack in the rock that someone, long ago, had widened and sealed. It was exactly as the journal had described. This was the foundation of her home. This was the beginning. Her first task, undertaken on October 28, 1876, was not construction, but deconstruction. She needed money. The silver locket was the only thing of value she possessed. She walked to the next town, a mining settlement called Dusty Fork, a 5-hour trek over the pass. There, where no one knew her as the Orphanage girl, she sold it to a pawnbroker for $6. It was a pittance, but it was enough. With that money, she did not buy food or warm clothes. She bought a sturdy shovel, a pickaxe, and a length of rope from a hardware merchant. The cost was $4.50. The remaining $1.50, added to her original $2, gave her a working capital of $3.50. It would have to be enough. For the next 2 weeks, Alara worked with a singular, consuming focus. The journal was her guide, her teacher, her silent partner. The first step was excavation. The existing fissure was only about 5 feet deep and 10 feet wide. The plans called for a rectangular pit, dug into the earth from the mouth of the fissure, that would be 30 feet long and 14 feet wide. The most critical measurement was the depth. The northern rear wall needed to be excavated to a depth of 9 feet below the surface, placing the floor well below the frost line, which in these mountains could reach 4 feet deep. The southern, front-facing wall would be shallower, creating a floor that gently sloped upwards towards the entrance. The work was brutal. The topsoil was thin, giving way to dense, clay-like earth and then to rock. Every morning she would rise before dawn, eat a cold breakfast of hard bread, and begin to dig. The pickaxe became an extension of her arms, swinging in a steady, rhythmic arc. The shovel lifted the loosened earth and rock, which she hauled out of the growing pit using a bucket and her length of rope. Her hands, soft from years of indoor orphanage chores, were soon blistered, then calloused, then raw again. Her back and shoulders ached with a fire that never fully subsided. She grew leaner, her girlish frame hardening into sinew and muscle. She was fueled by a cold, clear-eyed determination. Every bucket of dirt was a stone in the wall of her defiance. Every inch she dug deeper was a step further away from the poorhouse and the town's pity. By mid-November, The pit was complete. It was a precise, geometric wound in the hillside, its earthen walls straight, its floor graded exactly as the journal's diagrams instructed. She had moved, by her own estimation, over 3,700 cubic feet of earth and rock, one bucket at a time. During the excavation, she had carefully set aside every large, flat stone she unearthed. These now formed a neat, waist-high pile. They were to become the heart of her home's climate control system, the thermal mass. The next phase was construction of the north wall. The rear of the pit was the exposed 9-foot-high earth. The journal instructed that this wall and the two shorter side walls must be lined with stone. This was not for structural support, the hard-packed earth provided that, but for thermal storage. The stone would absorb the sun's heat during the day and slowly radiate it back into the dwelling throughout the night. Using the largest, flattest stones from her pile, she began to build. Her mortar was a mixture of the clay she had dug from the pit, water from a nearby stream, and dried grass for a binder. It was slow, painstaking work, fitting the stones together like a complex puzzle. She built the wall 2 feet thick, a dense, solid barrier between her living space and the frozen earth behind it. While the clay mortar cured, she turned her attention to the most critical and challenging element, the roof. The roof needed to be strong enough to support a heavy load of snow, yet transparent enough to allow the low-angled winter sunlight to flood the interior and strike the northern thermal wall. It was a delicate balance of engineering and resourcefulness. The council's refusal to grant her access to the scrap heap meant she had to find her own materials. Mr. Blackwood's mill had a large pile of discarded lumber, split logs, warped boards, and offcuts deemed unsuitable for sale. At night, under the sliver of a new moon, Ilara made several trips, dragging back heavy pieces of timber one by one. It was theft, but she reconciled it in her mind as taking what was owed. They had denied her trash, she was merely collecting it. Using a borrowed saw, she cut the timbers to size. The main support would be a massive ridge beam running the 30-foot length of the dwelling. This was supported by 3 thick posts set into the floor. From this beam, she ran rafters down to a low, south-facing knee wall she had built at the front of the pit. The angle of the roof was precise, calculated from the diagrams in the journal to be perpendicular to the sun's rays at the winter solstice. This angle, approximately 27 degrees from the horizontal, ensured that the maximum amount of solar energy would enter the structure, while the steeper angle would help shed snow. The glazing was the greatest hurdle. Glass was prohibitively expensive. Even salvaged panes were beyond her means. Her $3.50 were nearly gone, spent on a few pounds of oats and some salt. The journal offered an alternative. Tightly woven canvas, treated with multiple coats of linseed oil, could be stretched across the rafters to create a durable, translucent membrane. It would not be as clear as glass, but it would allow a significant amount of light to pass through while being waterproof and surprisingly well insulating. Linseed oil was sold at Mr. Thorne's general store. The price was 60 cents for a quart, far more than she had. It was then that she remembered the small, hidden pocket inside the oilskin parcel. Tucked into a seam was a small, cloth-wrapped roll. She had assumed it was padding. Opening it carefully, she found 7 silver dollars, minted in the 1850s, cool and heavy in her palm. They must have been her mother's last reserve, hidden for an emergency. This was that emergency. She walked back into Providence, not to the council hall, but to the general store. Mr. Thorne looked at her with surprise, his expression quickly souring into suspicion when she placed 2 of the silver dollars on the counter. "I need 2 quarts of your best linseed oil," she said, her voice flat, "and a box of nails." He tested the coins with his teeth before completing the transaction, his disapproval a palpable force in the air. He did not ask what she was building. He did not care. He had already judged her venture a failure. She spent the next 3 days applying the oil to several lengths of canvas she had sewn together from old grain sacks, which she had purchased for a few cents from the livery. She laid them out in the weak autumn sun, the oil soaking into the fibers, turning the rough fabric into a stiff, yellowish, waterproof material that glowed when held up to the light. With the last of her nails and a great deal of effort, she stretched and secured the treated canvas over the entire 30 by 16-foot roof frame. The interior of the pit was plunged into a dim golden light. Her shelter was now enclosed. The final pieces of the design were the most ingenious. At the base of the south-facing entrance, she dug a trench 2 feet wide and 3 feet deep, running the width of the structure. The journal called this a cold sink. Since cold air is denser than warm air, any that entered the dwelling would fall into this trench and become trapped, preventing it from cooling the main living space. She also excavated 2 ventilation shafts. One was a narrow 6-inch diameter tunnel that ran from the highest point of the rear wall up through 20 feet of earth to the surface of the hill above. The other was a similar tunnel, originating from the floor at the front. This created a natural convection loop. As the sun heated the air inside, it would rise and exit through the high vent, drawing in fresh, cool air through the lower one, ensuring constant air circulation and preventing the buildup of moisture and stale air. By the first week of December, the primary construction was complete. The exterior was almost invisible, just a low, translucent roofline angled against the hill, already dusted with the first persistent snows. The entrance was a simple, heavy wooden door she had fashioned from salvaged planks. Inside, the transformation was remarkable. The air was still and cool, but not cold. It smelled of damp earth, clay, and linseed oil. The stone walls felt cool to the touch, but held a latent energy. The light, filtered through the oiled canvas, was soft and calming. She had built a small, efficient wood stove in one corner, its flue piped out through a carefully sealed hole in the roof, for cooking and supplementary heat. For this, she had spent another of her precious silver dollars on the stovepipe and a used firebox from a traveling tinker. She moved her few belongings inside: a bedroll, a cooking pot, the journal, and the remaining provisions she had bought with her silver. She had spent a total of $27 on materials, including the $6 from her locket and the $7 from her mother's hidden cash. The home had been paid for with foresight, desperation, and an immense amount of physical labor. As the temperatures outside dropped further each night, the temperature inside her dwelling remained remarkably stable. After a sunny day, the interior would be a pleasant 60 degrees Fahrenheit. By morning, after a long, freezing night, the temperature would have dropped no lower than 45 degrees. The earth was her blanket. The sun was her furnace. In the town of Providence, the citizens prepared for winter in the conventional way. They stacked cords of firewood high against their houses. They stuffed rags into the gaps in their window frames and door jambs. Their tall, timber frame houses were designed to fight the cold, to hold it at bay with the constant, ravenous consumption of fuel. They saw Ilara's strange structure on the hill, if they saw it at all, as a bizarre folly, the final, sad act of a troubled girl. Deacon Miller mentioned her in a sermon, a cautionary tale about the sin of pride and the foolishness of rejecting community wisdom. No one came to visit her. No one offered help. They left her alone in her hole in the ground to face the judgment of the mountain winter. Winter arrived not as a gentle guest, but as a conquering army. December was cold and snowy, but manageable. The people of Providence felt the smug satisfaction of the well-prepared. Their chimneys plumed smoke into the gray sky, a testament to their foresight and prosperity. Ilara, in her earthen home, was comfortable. She used her small stove only for an hour in the morning to boil water and an hour in the evening to cook her simple meal of beans or salted meat. The rest of the time, the passive heat from the sun and the earth was enough. She even began to experiment with a small garden bed she had built along the warm north wall, planting a few precious seeds for lettuce and herbs she had bought with her last coins. They sprouted in the golden light, a defiant patch of green in a world of white. The change came on January 18th, 1877. The sky, which had been a clear, piercing blue, turned a milky cataract white. The wind fell silent. An unnatural stillness descended on the valley, a profound and heavy quiet that made the old-timers look to the mountains with unease. The temperature began to plummet. By nightfall, it was 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Then, the snow began. It was not a gentle flurry, but a fine, hard-driven powder, like sand, that hissed against the walls and windows. The wind rose with a low moan that quickly escalated into a screeching, banshee howl. This was no ordinary storm. This was a blizzard of a magnitude none of them had ever witnessed. The people of Providence huddled in their homes, feeding their stoves and fireplaces with a steady supply of logs. The wind, a physical force, hammered at their houses, finding every crack and crevice, driving the needle-like snow into their attics and under their doors. The temperature dropped to 20 below, then 30. The firewood that was meant to last for weeks was being consumed in days. For 3 days, the storm raged without cease. The world outside the windows vanished into a swirling vortex of white. Snow drifted up to the eaves of the houses. Travel was impossible. Families were isolated, trapped in their wooden boxes, fighting a losing battle against the penetrating cold. The first to die was an elderly couple, the Abernathys. They ran out of wood on the second night. Their neighbors found them frozen in their beds after the storm's first brief lull. In her dwelling, Alara was safe. The wind howled harmlessly over the low profile of her roof. The several feet of snow that had accumulated on top of it was not a burden, but a blessing. It was a perfect, fluffy blanket of insulation, adding to the protection offered by the earth. The temperature inside her home never dropped below 50 degrees. The light from the canvas roof was dimmer, a diffuse, serene glow, but it was enough to see by. Her small patch of lettuce was thriving. She was warm, she had food, and she was secure. She listened to the storm, not with fear, but with a sense of profound, somber respect for the power of the nature her home was designed to accommodate, not defy. On the fourth day, the wind slackened slightly, though the snow continued to fall heavily. In town, the situation was becoming catastrophic. Several families had exhausted their fuel and were burning furniture to stay alive. The roof of the livery stable had collapsed under the immense weight of the snow, killing the animals inside. A desperate plan was formed by Deacon Miller and the other council members. They would try to move the most vulnerable families, those out of wood, to the meeting hall, which had the largest stove and a substantial reserve of firewood in its cellar. It was a fatal miscalculation. The meeting hall, with its proud, steep roof designed to shed snow, had a flaw. An unusually heavy drift had formed on the leeward side of the peak, creating an unbalanced load that the building's rafters were never designed to withstand. At just past noon, as 24 men, women, and children were huddled inside, the ridge beam cracked with a sound like a cannon shot. A moment later, the entire northern half of the roof gave way, burying the occupants in a crushing avalanche of heavy timbers and tons of snow. Those who were not killed instantly were trapped, injured, and freezing in the ruins. Deacon Miller, Mr. Blackwood, and Mr. Thorne had been near the southern entrance and were thrown clear, escaping the worst of the collapse. They were alive, but they were now outside, battered, bruised, and exposed to the full fury of the blizzard. Their own homes were blocked by impassable drifts, their fuel supplies likely exhausted anyway. They and a handful of other survivors huddled together behind a broken wall, the wind tearing at their clothes, the cold sinking into their bones. They were going to die. It was Mr. Thorne who said it, his words barely audible over the shriek of the wind, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. The girl, the orphan girl, in her hole. It was a desperate, insane idea, a straw clutched by freezing, dying men. They had mocked her, dismissed her, condemned her to die in her tomb. Now, that tomb was their only, infinitesimal hope. Led by Deacon Miller, a small group of 7 men, the strongest of the survivors, began the torturous journey out of the ruined town and up the slope toward Alara's land. The 2-mile walk was a journey through a frozen hell. The snow was waist-deep, in some places chest-deep. The wind scoured their faces with ice crystals, and the air was so cold it burned their lungs. They were guided only by memory and a primal instinct for survival. Twice, one of the men fell and wanted to give up, to simply lie down and let the sleep of the cold take him. Each time, Deacon Miller, his face a mask of frozen tears and grim determination, hauled him to his feet. The irony of their situation was a bitter gall in his throat. He had preached wisdom from a pulpit of wood, in a house of wood, and it had all proven to be a coffin. He was leading a pilgrimage of fools to the door of the prophet they had scorned. After what felt like an eternity, they stumbled upon it. They almost missed it entirely. All that was visible was the top of a wooden doorframe and a single small stovepipe poking out of a vast, smooth drift of snow. A faint, almost invisible wisp of smoke rising from it. It looked impossibly small, impossibly fragile against the immensity of the storm. They clawed at the snow with frozen, clumsy hands, clearing a path to the door. Mr. Blackwood, his lungs ragged, pounded on the wood with what little strength he had left. The door swung inward. A wave of warm, earthy-smelling air washed over them, a stark, unbelievable contrast to the lethal cold. Ilara stood there, framed in the soft, golden light of the interior. She held a small lantern. Her expression was not one of surprise or triumph or fear. It was calm, steady, and unreadable. She simply looked at the 7 half-frozen men, their beards and eyebrows caked in ice, their faces gaunt with shock and exhaustion. Deacon Miller fell to his knees at the threshold, unable to speak. He could only look past her into the impossible space. It was not a damp, dark hole. It was a long, warm, well-lit room. The air was fresh. He could see the green of living plants growing along the stone wall at the back. He saw a neat stack of firewood that was barely diminished. He saw a space that was not just surviving, but thriving. It was a sanctuary. Ilara stepped back, holding the door open. She said nothing. She did not need to. Her silence was more profound than any words of accusation or forgiveness could ever be. She simply made way for them to enter the home they had condemned, to receive the life they had thrown away. One by one, they staggered past her, collapsing onto the warm earthen floor, their bodies racked with shudders of cold and relief. They had come seeking a tomb, and they had found an ark. For 2 more days, the blizzard held the valley in its grip. Ilara worked methodically, her quiet competence a stark contrast to the broken state of the men she had rescued. She melted snow for water. She prepared a thin but hot broth, rationing her supplies to accommodate her unexpected guests. She gave them blankets and tended to their frostbite with a calm efficiency that belied her years. She moved about her subterranean home with a quiet grace, the undisputed master of a domain they had not been able to comprehend. The men, including the town's most powerful leaders, were humbled into silence. They watched her as she tended her small garden, harvesting a few fresh leaves to add to their soup. They felt the radiant warmth from the stone wall long after the sun had set. They saw the elegant simplicity of the ventilation system, the clever design of the cold sink at the door. They were living inside the very foolish pagan notions they had so arrogantly dismissed. Their conventional wisdom, their timber houses, their generations of experience, it had all failed them. It had killed their friends and neighbors. This 16-year-old girl, with nothing but an old journal and her own 2 hands, had understood the mountain in a way they never had. She had not fought the winter, she had embraced it. She had not built against nature, she had built with it. When the storm finally broke on the morning of January 23rd, the world was revealed in a state of blinding white and profound silence. The valley was buried. The town of Providence was a ruin field of collapsed roofs and impassable drifts. Of the 112 souls who had lived in the town, 37 were dead. The survivors, guided by Alara, dug their way back to the devastated town. The tale of the rescue spread, a legend born in the heart of a catastrophe. The men who had stumbled to her door, the leaders who had scorned her, now spoke of her with a reverence usually reserved for saints. Deacon Miller stood before the shattered remains of his congregation and delivered a sermon of profound and public repentance. He confessed their arrogance, their willful ignorance, and their failure. He pointed to Alara, who stood quietly at the back of the crowd, and called her the savior of Providence. Vindication was not a triumphant, gloating moment. It was a somber, heavy reality. It had been purchased with the lives of their neighbors. The sight of Mr. Hemlock, his face etched with a grief that went beyond his professional duties, building coffin after coffin from salvaged timber, was a constant, searing reminder of the cost of their folly. Not one of them had lost a family member in the meeting hall collapse, a fact they owed solely to her. Not one had burned through their wood supply and frozen in their beds, and not one, in the weeks and months that followed, would ever again presume to tell her what was wise. Ilara's life was irrevocably changed. She was no longer the outcast orphan. She was the keeper of a deeper wisdom. The leather-bound journal was brought to the town's new temporary meeting place, a large, communally built dugout modeled on her own, and its pages were translated and copied for all to study. The principles of thermal mass, passive solar design, and earth-sheltered construction became the new gospel of survival in the high mountains. The town of Providence was rebuilt, but it did not rise again in the same form. The new houses were built into the south-facing slopes, their roofs angled to the winter sun, their foundations sunk deep into the earth's unfailing warmth. Timber was used sparingly, for frames and supports, not as the primary defense against the cold. Mr. Blackwood's mill began cutting lumber to new specifications, for structures designed to coexist with the environment. Mr. Thorne's store began to stock large panes of glass and books on geology and engineering. The town learned. It adapted. It survived. Alara never sought a position of leadership, but she became the community's unquestioned sage. She taught them how to read the land, how to understand the sun's path, how to build homes that were shelters rather than traps. She never married, never sought a family of her own, for in a way, the entire town had become her family, bound to her by a debt of life and a shared memory of a terrible, humbling winter. Her home, the original dwelling, became a kind of shrine, a place where the children were brought to learn the story of the Great Blizzard of '77, and of the young woman who, by trusting forgotten knowledge and the strength of her own hands, had shown them all the true path to survival. She had been given the keys to a sealed cave, and with them, she had unlocked the future.